Hello and welcome to All Generations. Today I'm going to be talking about the most popular baby names from each generation, from the silent generation to Generation Z. Sorry the greatest generation and Gen Alphas, not this time. Now, keep in mind a couple of things. One, I will be using the birth years Pew uses in this video. This is not a video about which birth years are best. I just wanted to pull from one source which has defined birth years to make it easier. Two, I am pulling the names from the US Social Security government website. So these are all from the United States. On the website, they have them separated, male and female. So that is also what I'm going to do in this video. On the Social Security website, you can see the top names, the top 5 names for every year. You can also see the top names for every decade, and you can search by state. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff there. I may be also at times for graphics pulling from another website which uses that data. So just keep that in mind. What I did was look at each generation, the birth years, take the top 5 baby names for male and female for each year of that generation and count how many instances those names appeared in the top 5, each of the names that appeared in the top 5. It is not a perfect method. I wanted to take the actual numbers for more of the names and give you a better representation, but I also wanted to stay on my current upload schedule. And all in all, I think this is still a pretty good representation of this information. If you want more or better analysis, let me know in the comments though. I will also mention the top names for the decades to give you a little bit more insight. For some names, I will also touch on how they might have become popular or why they might have lessened in popularity and things like that. Also, here's a shout out to everyone who had a popular name and had to go by their first name and last initial in school, or even after. Okay, that is enough for this intro. Let's get into it. Let's start with the silent generation. The birth years we're using for the silent generation are 1928 to 1945. All right, let's begin with the number 1 female winner, the most popular name for the silent generation, because there is a clear top name. It's Mary. Mary was the number 1 most popular name every year from 1928 through 1945. Mary was actually the most popular name all the way from 1900 to 1946, where it drops to number 2. Then it later goes back up to number 1. Anyway, it fluctuates, but it was clearly incredibly popular for a long time. The 60s is the beginning of a gradual decrease in popularity for the name. And it wasn't until 2009 that the name wasn't in the top 100. Some people suspect that television somehow played a role in the decline of Mary. Another possibility is the increase in desire for individuality and uniqueness in the US. Another influence could be secularization, though other religious names have remained popular. And one more cited reason for the eventual decline in the name is that people make jokes about it. With its huge apparent popularity, I do find it strange that I don't know Mary's. I couldn't think of a single one. So I went through my social media accounts and I finally did find one, my first grade best friend's older sister, and that's it. So comment below if you know a Mary. Where are the Marys at? Anyway, Barbara was the next most popular name for the silents, appearing 15 out of 18 of the years in the top 5. Then we have Betty, Patricia, and finally Dorothy. Betty and Dorothy were more common at the beginning of the generation, while Patricia and Barbara were more common at the end. If you're wondering if Dorothy became popular because of the Wizard of Oz, it kind of actually seems like no. The name Dorothy was already really popular then, and so Dorothy, the name probably came from it just already being so popular. And there was actually a decline after the movie came out in 1939. Similarly, Betty was already popular when Betty Boop came out. All in all, there was a total of 13 names which made the top 5 over these 18 years. The other names, which I haven't mentioned, are Shirley, Linda, Carol, Helen, Joan, Margaret, and Judith. Now, on to the male names. In the male section, the same names pretty much remain popular the whole time. James, Robert, John, and William were in the top 5 every single year of the silent generation. Richard was up there in 16 out of 18 of the years, and the name Charles snuck in early on in 1920 and 29. While John took the #1 spot in 1928, most of the time it was either Robert or James. Because it ranked #1 so many years, I'm going to call Robert the #1 silent generation male name. But if we're talking about another contender, it would be James. While Robert has recently become less popular, it still remains in the top 100, and James has remained in the top 20 since 1900. Really, all of them have maintained some popularity. Now, the 30s are all silent. It's the only decade that is pure silent. So I'm just going to mention the top 5 male and female for the decade of the 30s, which it doesn't encompass all of it, but is all silent. The top 5 names for females were Mary, Betty, Barbara, Shirley, and Patricia. And the top 5 for males were Robert, James, John, William, and Richard. So all in all, pretty consistent. Now we'll talk about the boomers. The birth years for the boomers are 1946 to 1964. Over the course of this time, 12 names made it into the top 5 for females. Those names are Mary, Linda, Susan, Patricia, Karen, Barbara, Deborah, Lisa, Deborah, Donna, Carol, and Sandra. My mother-in-law has 5 sisters, and of the 6 sisters, 5 of them have one of these names, though one of them is just a variation of one of the names, but wow. Anyway, the most popular / #1 name for the boomers is the same as it was for the silents. Mary. Mary ranked in the top 2 every year, spending 10 years as #1. Again, I have to say, where are all of them? I'm thinking some of them must go by their middle names. The name Linda was in the top 5 every year but 1. It started out strong in the late 40s and early 50s, and by 64 it was no longer in the top 5. But since we have Mary as #1 for both of these, if you want to choose a sort of alternative or a second top name for each of them, the next one for silence would be Barbara, and the next one for boomers would be Linda. Linda has actually been called the trendiest name by some. I found a couple articles referencing some piece on Proofreader, which the links are broken now, so not really sure about that. But anyway, what they said was the trendiness was measured by how sharply it rose and then fell in popularity. In this case, the trendiness factor seems to be influenced by a song called Linda by Buddy Clark. It was sang by Buddy Clark, but written by someone else. The song was actually named after Linda Eastman, who eventually married Paul McCartney, but she was a baby at the time it was written about her. And Linda actually was already a popular name, but the song just shot it up in popularity. So we have Susan, which ranked in the top 5, 16 of the 19 baby boomer years. Then Patricia, ranking 11 out of 19 of the years. And finally coming in at 5, everyone's favorite, Karen, ranking 8 out of the 19 years in the top 5. Really, Karens seem to be most popular at the end of the baby boomer years. The name didn't rank in the top 5 until 1957, but was up there every year after that. And it wasn't until more recently that the name became more of an insult. I should note that Deborah didn't rank above it only because it was divided into 2 spellings, which technically 2 different names, Deborah, though commonly I think pronounced about the same. Deborah was there most in the early to mid 50s, and then in the mid 50s suddenly they decided Deborah. So the whole spelling something a little bit differently thing, not new. It's possible some of these Deborahs were named after actresses Deborah Kerr and Deborah Paget, not sure, with the different respective spellings. So Deborah Kerr came first and then the other Deborah came after. So that also follows with how the naming pattern went. Both of these actresses were in some big movies in the 50s. I found a blogger who thought that maybe Karen could actually have gotten some popularity from a role one of the Deborahs played, which was a character named Karen in a film called Here to Eternity. Now, with the males, there is a lot of the same again. Throughout this period of 19 years, I'm pulling from 7 names ranked in the top 5, so I'm just going to tell you all of them. James, Robert, and John ranked in the top 5 every year. James and Robert started out strong earlier and fell a little bit, but obviously they're still all wildly popular because they're still in the top 5. So it's another James versus Robert face-off, but where Robert came out ahead last time, I think James is the winner for the boomers. So number 1 baby boomer name for males, James. Sometimes James go by Jim, just like Matthew, Matt, Christopher, Chris, etc. Michael, which was present 16 out of 19 of the years in the top 5, went in an opposite pattern, not appearing for the first few years and gaining popularity, so it held a top spot in the last years. David also placed 16 out of 19 of the years. Finally, William and Richard were there earlier on, ranking 4 and 2 times respectively. The only decade which is full boomer is the 50s, but parts of the 40s and 60s are clearly included. So now I'm going to tell you the top 5 for 50s and 60s for the decade, and that's by a sheer number, which is a little different than the others. So that's telling you the, like, population-wise, how many, like the most that were named that out of that period of time. In the 50s, the most popular baby names were Mary, Linda, Patricia, Susan, and Deborah for females. And for males, James, Michael, Robert, John, and David. So we're not seeing any names that I didn't mention. The top 5 baby names for females in the 1960s were Lisa, Mary, Susan, Karen, and Kimberly. And the top 5 baby names for males were Michael, David, John, James, and Robert. For the most part, it's pretty consistent. Now to Generation X. Birth years we are using are 1965 to 1980, and so this includes 16 years. For Gen X, we have a new top female name. It's another clear winner, but not one we saw placing in the top 5 in the past 2 generations. It is Jennifer. Jennifer was the number 1 female baby name every year from 1970 to 1984. In 1970, there was a film called Love Story, and there's a character named Jennifer/Jenny, and that's probably responsible for a lot of the popularity.
That's a good reason.
Or at least some of it. There was also an actress named Jennifer Jones, so film was definitely an influence on this name. Now we're seeing tons of actresses with that name, but many of them are a product of this time. Overall, there were 14 names in the top 5 over these 16 years. The top 5 that occurred most frequently after Jennifer were in order: Amy, Lisa, Michelle, and Kimberly. Lisa spent the earlier part of the Gen X birth years as number 1 until Jennifer took over. The other names which ranked in the top 5 some of these years were Melissa, Heather, Jessica, Mary, Angela, Amanda, Susan, and Sarah. On to the male names. We also have a new top name in this section, though it was present in previous years, just wasn't number 1. Michael was the number 1 every year. So that makes it the top Gen X male name. James and David were also present in the top 5 every single year. Christopher was present 9 out of 16 times, and Jason and John were there half the time. Finally, Robert was number 5 every year from 1965 through 1971. And that is all the names which appear in the top. The name Jason may have gained some popularity from some characters like actors, but I did not recognize them, so I couldn't say which ones probably had more influence. Christopher can be a religious name for some, but others may have drawn inspiration from characters like Christopher Robin and Winnie the Pooh, which that one actually makes a little bit sense because it's a child that they would have been naming their child after. Now for the decades, the 1970s are all Gen X using the birth years we're using. The top 5 baby names for females of the 70s were Jennifer, Amy, Melissa, Michelle, and Kimberly. And for males, Michael, Christopher, Jason, David, and James. Now, on to Millennials. The birth years Pew uses are 1981 through 1996, and remember, don't at me about that. For females, 8 names made it into the top 5 over all these millennial years, which is less than all of the others, which means it was more of the same names at the top for millennials, which is interesting. So, the number 1 female name for millennials is Jessica. It was either number 1 or number 2 each of those years. I have a friend named Jessica, and I knew many Jessicas in school. When I went to college, I had 3 roommates initially, and 2 of the 3 were named Jessica. So unlike with the Marys, I know that the Jessicas are out there. The name Jessica also has some origins with actresses / characters. There was some Jessica on Murder, She Wrote, there's Jessica Rabbit, there's plenty of Jessicas. And there's also Jessicas that came from this time of a lot of Jessicas being born. In 2019, there was a Washington Post article called "The Jessicas Are Turning 30." The article found 10 Jessicas born in 1989 to see what turning 30 looked like in 2019. Now it's 2020. If you have any advice for turning 30, be sure to let me know. On to the other top names. Ashley and Sarah were both present in 14 of the 16 years. Amanda made it in 12 times, and Jennifer appeared in the top 5 half of the years. I know people with all of these names, and one of them is my sister. Just for reference, the other names which appeared in the top 5 were Samantha, Emily, and Brittany. The name Samantha initially gained popularity farther back due to the show Bewitched, which came out in 1964, and then it just kind of gradually climbed in popularity. Other characters might have had influence too, though, like Samantha from Who's the Boss? Moving on to the males, we are seeing another repeat this time. The number 1 millennial boy name is Michael. It was number 1 every single year. And yes, this was also the number 1 name for Gen X. And it was a top boomer name. It held strong popularity for a long time, though more recently the name is in a little bit of a decline. Funny story, it was actually a Michael that was responsible for the US federal baby names list. He was an employee at the Social Security Administration in the 90s, and he was annoyed at how many Michaels there were. So he had a baby coming, or at least soon, and he decided he was going to get that information so his child would not be in the same situation that he felt he was in. But anyway, in 2017, there were some articles on how the name was going out. An independent article even said the name Michael is facing extinction in the US. I wouldn't quite say that, as it's still ranked 14 in 2018, at least the data I was looking at. But it is not holding that number 1 spot that it did for so long. The article cites basically what Michael Shackelford wanted is that, more parents seeking individuality for their children. Michael can be a religious name, but there also have been a lot of celebrities with the name like Michael Jordan, Michael Jackson, Michael J. Fox, etc. Christopher was number 2 every year until 95, while Matthew was number 3 every year until 95, where it switched places with Christopher. Then we have Joshua in the top 5 14 out of 16 of the years, and David 7 out of 16 of the years. The other names in the top 5 were Andrew, Jacob, Jason, Tyler, and Daniel. And I'll just say I agree. These were popular names for my generation. I know all of them. So unlike the other generations, at least using these birth years, there is no single decade that is only millennial. But the dominant decade is definitely the 80s. The top 5 baby female names in the 80s were Jessica, Jennifer, Amanda, Ashley, and Sarah. The top 5 for boys were Michael, Christopher, Joshua, and David. In the 90s, the names were Jessica, Ashley, Emily, Sarah, and Samantha. And for boys, Michael, Christopher, Matthew, Joshua, and Jacob. Time for Generation Z. Pew has not set an end year for Generation Z yet. They just say born after 1996. So they're a new generation / young generation, so we don't have a good end year yet. If we look at past generations though, just with Pew, they gave 18 years to the Silents, 19 years to the Boomers, and 16 years to the Xers and Millennials. So for the sake of this video, we're just gonna give them 16 years and bring it up to 2012. Some people have been ending it there regardless of the starting year. So first, the top female baby Gen Z name is Emily. It was number 1 every year from 1997 to 2008, and then number 3 in 2008. It ranked in the top 5 12 out of the 16 years. So we're seeing these names, none of them are ranking, for at least for the females, all of the years. A similar name, Emma, is next. That one shows up in the top 5 11 out of 16 of the years. It kind of took over from Emily, ranking high from 2002 to 2012. Kind of a little similar to what we saw with Deborah to Deborah with the boomers. But Deborah didn't come out as strong as Emma is. One article I read actually said that Emma may be due to a trend of naming children after their great-grandmothers, because there was a more of a spike back when their great-grandmothers, maybe even grandmother, it depends on the individual, would have been, and then for them. And then I read an article on Quartz which said that there is this, or at least there was / is this trend towards short names with multiple vowels, such as Leela or Ella, and Emma just kind of went along with this trend, so that reinforced it. Plus, there have been some celebrities with the name, like Emma Watson, Emma Stone, etc. And then we have Madison, Hannah, and Olivia. All of those ranked in the top 5 half of the years. So the rise in popularity of the name Madison is kind of interesting. In 1984, what I think was a romantic comedy called Splash came out. The main characters are a guy named Alan and a mermaid. The mermaid, I guess, can't pronounce her name in English or something, so she's out and she sees a sign for Madison Avenue and decides, Madison, that will be my name. And then she tells the character Alan, which is Tom Hanks, that is her name, and he says, Madison's not a name.
Elizabeth,
Madison.
Samantha.
Madison, I like Madison.
Well, Madison's not a name.
As a Yahoo Entertainment article put it, it of course was in fact the last name of a US president, the name of a city in Wisconsin, and most relevantly, the name of one very famous avenue in New York City. That was kind of how it was viewed at the time, not so much a name, and if it was a name, it was a boy's name. Definitely people didn't see it as a female name. But it's pretty clear that some people saw that movie and said, you know what, it is a name for females. Because the next year, in 1985, that is when it appears on the charts. There is nothing for the baby female names before that. Once the movie came out, it suddenly became a thing and it just rose in popularity. Author Joel Ryan notes that the trend toward using last names as first names was kind of becoming popular, and so that probably helped with its popularity as well. So if your name is Madison and you like mermaids, you may have been named after a fictional one, though you may already know that. For Generation Z, there was a total of 14 names that ranked in the top 5 over these years. The other ones were Isabella, Ava, Sophia, Sarah, Ashley, Alexis, Samantha, Jessica, and Abigail. Now, for the most popular Gen Z baby male name, it is Jacob. Michael was still number 1 in 1997 and 1998, but after that, Jacob is number 1 for the rest of the years. Michael is next, though, in most instances in the top 5, followed by Joshua, Matthew, and a new one, Ethan. For Ethan, I just think of Ethan and Lizzie McGuire, though. In this section, just like with the other section, for Gen Z, there were 14 names that ranked in the top 5 over the 16 years. The other names are William, Christopher, Mason, Noah, Jaden, Daniel, Alexander, and Nicholas. So now let's take a look at the most popular by number, by population with that name. Those names are Emily, Madison, Emma, Olivia, and Hannah, and Jacob, Michael, Joshua, Matthew, and Daniel. Alright, that is it for the top names by generation. Please give this video a like if you learned anything new, and subscribe to see more content on the generations. Comment if you want to hear me talk about anything else name related or something else in general for any future videos. See you next time!